a lawyer specializing in human rights and the European Union law. Really interesting. An introduction to CEDAW, an outline of the original text mechanisms, and bringing us up to date with changes since 1979, explaining where the UN is now on CEDAW.
So let's just start right at the beginning, the United Nations system. This is 193 countries now, which is effectively every country in the world. And all the countries that are represented have equal representation at the UN General Assembly, and they create legal texts of all sorts, including treaties. Many of them, however, are strongly anti-women's rights, also children's rights, which is a new issue, and very strongly anti-LGBT rights. So, for example, homosexuals can be punished by death in 10 countries, 73 countries criminalize homosexual activity, just to give a little sort of background. So there's a lot of countries in there that think they're interested in human rights in the UN, but actually practices are very different. I just point right at the beginning that trans issues have been slid onto the end of LGBT rights very actively over the past 15 years or so. So this is a hot issue at the UN, but it very much always, you see, LGBT, okay? And it's just sort of come from nowhere. Campaigners, therefore, on these issues will be trying to get a whole package through to protect LGBT rights and at the same time trans rights. So obviously for LGBT people, that creates a bit of a difficulty. And just a couple of little bits of background, which I hope you can see. Within the UN, there's a huge organization that covers everything, and it's called UN Women. And you can go on their site and see about lots and lots of things. Also, I want to make clear, unfortunately, at the moment, I can't see this very easily. Conventions and treaties are legally binding in another way. If you see other documents with other titles like resolutions, they're not legally binding, and this is very important. So, of course, the UN kicked off in 1950 with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and it was the first time we, real human beings, had any rights at the international level. It covers everybody. That's the way it talks, and everybody has equal rights. At the time, it declared that everybody had to be free of distinctions on race, color, sex, language, etc. Anybody who's looked at human rights things will see normally this list of things, and they are covering, therefore, in 1950, sex. It's also to bear in mind, well, how does this general human rights arrangement work? Human rights are to be universal and inalienable. You can't give them away voluntary. They're indivisible, they all work together. They work when they're interdependent and interrelated. You know, if you don't really have rights, proper rights and access to employment, you're not going to be able to operate any of the other human rights that you have. We need the package. So, countries have got to ensure that everybody in their country have their human rights, that the rule of law is enforced in their country. You can't, it was clear at the beginning, you can't remove human rights by saying there are cultural and religious ideas in our country which defeats this. Can't do that. And I dealt with the fact that they can't be voluntarily given away. And here we are again, it's better. Conventions and treaties are legally binding. Declarations, covenants, resolutions are not, okay? So, human rights have been developing. So at the UN level, at the moment now, there are 9 different conventions. Don't worry about reading this whole list and memorizing it or anything. But just to give you an idea, kicking off in 1969, a new convention came in, right up to the latest one, which is in fact 2010. So the international community has been increasing and improving human rights by looking at different sectors. And of course, this mimics, this is because different groups in society have developed a political voice and a better standing, and they've been able to push forward their concerns and get new texts developed. So of course, the most important one for women came in 1981, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. And so it's always called CEDAW. This covers women as a sex. That actually also includes the young ones, in other words, girls. So anybody who is of the female sex. Looking at this, you could also bear in mind later, again, the development of rights, children's rights came along. And there's a Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1990. Now that covers all children, male or female. The result of this, if you're a girl child, you have special rights under CEDAW, and you have special rights under the Convention on the Rights of the Child as well, okay? So you have to look into both texts if you're looking out for girl children. And right at the bottom, again, at the moment I can't see it, in none of these texts is there any mention of sexual orientation or gender identity in these treaties. So these conventions are all legally binding in a certain way. And what I'm going to say applies to them all, so it's useful to know that, although we'll now be focusing on CEDAW. Okay? So countries have signed up to all this, and there's a whole list of very useful human rights and principles there. Why don't we have them in our own laws immediately? Zack, as they say in Germany, or boom, or, you know, just like that. Well, because actually all these conventions, although they're legally binding, countries are agreeing legally to enter into a process to bring their human rights standards up to what is in these texts. They have got to change their own laws. The countries have got to change their own laws. They've got to change their own practices. And of course, this is a hugely complex and politically very difficult process. So that is why at the moment you can have 189 countries around the world who've signed up to CEDAW, but what happens with human rights for women in those countries differs hugely. And for example, there's no end date for this process, but it is, you're committing yourself to hopefully begin to a process. Some countries sign up and they have no intention at all of doing anything about it. We have to be realistic. Next, there's no Supreme Human Rights Court to go to globally. I simply state that as a fact, but obviously that would probably be a very useful thing. But you will hear these conventions mentioned because your judges in your national courts can use these principles if they want to. They're not compelled to, but they can. And often in countries where they're beginning to take women's rights more seriously, they will use them as part of their legal toolkit when they're deciding cases. They can say, no, there's a disputed area, but what did our country agree to at the UN? Well, when it signed the CEDAW Convention, it said it would be doing this. So I shall take that as a legal principle that I can now apply in my decision. So there is progress being made there. And also these conventions, because they're not so detailed, they are also more flexible, because they can, it's a basic principle, so you can apply it to new circumstances that come along. Okay. So how are they also being used? Well, the UN talks about treaty bodies for all these conventions. So for each convention, they've set up an international committee of independent experts with a big budget and a big department, and they are chasing, monitoring all the countries' implementation of these treaties. And so you would focus on the CEDAW committee, because basically they're called committees, and then the rest of the name is from the convention, torture convention, children's convention, etc. It'll have a committee. So CEDAW committee is for the women's rights one. And this, what they mainly do is this naughty step process, as I call it. Every 4 or 5 years, every country has to submit to the reporting process. So this committee looks in detail at your country and issues a public report on how you're doing. And so this is deemed to work through publicity and shame and giving people in the country a better idea of what's going on, providing information, swapping information across the world, putting on political pressure. And most importantly, the UN wants to talk to other organizations, NGOs, for example, and they are entitled to put in what are called shadow or alternative reports. So when your country is being looked at, an organization like this one, for example, can put in a report to the UN and say, well, here you're looking at this country, this is what we say is going on here, okay? And very often, obviously, the report that the country itself submits is very different from what the people who actually live in the country, the organizations in the country say. But again, this all brings publicity. And also these committees develop what are called general comments and recommendations about how their convention should be applied. And these are very useful to use and look at, but they are not legally binding.